Andrew Yang, who is working on his campaign for mayor of New York, was spotted in that city this week. That's not that extraordinary. At least the spotting of him wasn't, but his mask was kind of interesting. In a photo taken from outside a hair salon, his mask in the picture read, "Forward New York." Tell us what they think it means. Our Democratic strategist and council member at large in Montgomery County, Will Jawando, and also Capitol Hill reporter for the Daily Caller, Henry Rogers. So great to see you guys. Happy New Year's, by the way.
Happy New Year's. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, we almost made it, guys. We're almost there. Almost survived 2020. So, Will, I want to start with you on this because I think, one of the unique contributions you always have to this show is that you're actual local elected leader. So you really have this on the ground sense of, the possibilities and the limitations of those positions. So I think Andrew's move here to run for mayor is really interesting. I think he's got a lot to offer potentially in that position. But one of the questions I have is, he has this very sort of broad structural view, and obviously his signature idea of $1,000 checks a month was what really brought him to prominence on the presidential campaign trail. You can't always implement all of those big picture ideas at the local or the mayoral level. So what do you think are some of the sort of possibilities of this run, and what do you think are some of the limitations?
Yeah, well, it's a really thoughtful question and something I was thinking about leading into this segment. As a local elected official myself, and I represent 1.1 million people, which is a pretty good size jurisdiction. New York's obviously bigger. I do think you have outsized ability in some of these larger jurisdictions, and not even in larger jurisdictions, as an executive or as a member of a council or someone who is representing a large amount of people, to really be an incubator for progress. And one thing that COVID-19 and the pandemic and the fallout and what we've had to do to step up and the lack of presidential and a lot of times executive leadership from the governors is really try to provide for our residents, whether it be rental assistance or help support for small businesses, go down the list, other forms of temporary assistance. You can really do those programs at the local level. And at the scale and size of New York, I actually do think one of the things that attracts Andrew Yang, and I know him a little bit, is that he can be an incubator for national policy. And, because you can't get much of a bigger sample size and a diverse sample size as New York. And so I do think that, and the media spotlight gives him another set of eyes to try some of the policies that he thinks we need to take national. So I think that combined with the fact that the federal government was stagnant, you couldn't get anything done. We're still arguing about giving Americans who need it $1,400 extra so that they can try to make their bills and buy some food. And at the same time, at our level, we're taking action in states, mayors, cities, counties. And I think that appeals to someone like Andrew Yang, who just wants to get in there and really get some things done. Yeah.
I mean, Henry, the other thing that's really interesting to me about this is that it represents Andrew Yang having a shot in this race. And I think you were on the panel when we talked about some of the polling here that showed him with a decent shot at this. Not that it's in the bag at all. There's a lot of competition in the race, but that he actually has a credible shot here. It really represents a different sort of political track and landscape and reality because, in the past, New York is this machine town. You got to come up through the system. You got to have the right, endorsers on the ground and have worked your way from the ground up and been endorsed by the political machine here. Meanwhile, Andrew Yang has built this name for himself, this really, super energized and loyal following around new ideas and new thoughts about politics. And it just strikes me as the fact that he has a shot in this race is really an indication of how much the political landscape has changed, not just in New York, but across the country.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and I do remember that panel, too. And he was ahead in all of these polls. Early on, obviously, polling, hard to trust now. But still, I think Andrew Yang will run for president, as we saw him file paperwork the other day. And I do think that he is the right person for this job so far. No one else has came out. There's, I know, 40 people or so who put their names on the list so far to run. But no one else, in my eyes, is looking like the candidate for New York. I think the UBI is obviously extremely appealing to a lot of people. And like Will said, I mean, he just has a national spotlight over his head. That's going to drive him into the mayoral seat, I think, there in New York. I think he will be the next mayor, depending on what happens here. in Georgia. He's going to move back probably to New York City where he was living before, and I think he's going to fully commit to this thing. I think he will run. And listen, I love Andrew Yang. I said it before as a reporter, as someone who's had to ask him questions during the 2020 presidential elections. He was really one of the only people who did answer the questions that I had for him, and I respect that and I appreciate that. So I like genuine people, and I think he's a genuine guy.
Will, if whoever walks into this seat and whoever walks into any number of local and state elected offices over the next year have a tremendous amount of problems that are going to be facing them. Can you just sketch out a little bit of what the forecast for the next year looks like at the local level? Because, New York was hit so hard with the pandemic, one of the worst places in the entire country early on in the crisis when we were all still figuring out what's going on and how best to treat this disease and all of that, tremendous loss of life. You have massive, budgetary needs. You've had a loss on one side of tax revenue because you've had to close all these businesses and have all these shutdowns. And on the other hand, you've had an increase in costs because of the needs of dealing with this virus. Just sketch out some of what you're seeing at the local level and what sort of costs are going to be imposed on localities and choices elected officials are going to have to make over the next year.
Yeah, well, thank you for ending the 2020 on a high note for me, Crystal. I mean, you list many of the things we're thinking about. I think trying to project is always going to be hard. Obviously, who knew a year ago we were going to be dealing with what we were dealing with? But I actually think we are poised to make some of the structural and systemic changes we must make. And one of the reasons I think Andrew Yang is running is because he realizes this, that we must make to come back from this in an equitable way. If you look at, for example, Black and Latino residents, Latino residents, the highest infection rate, African Americans, the highest death rate, similar staggering statistics in who's lost their jobs and who has regained employment. Women, much more likely to have left the workforce. Of the 1 million people who stopped looking for work in September, 80% were women. Go down the line. The inequality and the disparities within this pandemic are a real challenge on top of the health crisis. And so things like, then talk about how do we get back to school? How much money is going to be necessary to get kids on buses, socially distanced, get teachers and educators the support they need, make sure that there's ventilation systems in the buildings so that air can move through quickly. Oh, and don't forget, we have to have local apparatuses. Dr. Fauci last night was on TV talking about the number one thing is getting localities the money they need to vaccinate people quickly and appropriately. So go down the list. And then, evictions and trying to keep people in their homes. And it's a long list, but I think it requires new revenues. It's going to require individual and very kind of unique thinking. I've been talking about progressive taxation. I've been talking about UBI. I know Andrew Yang will talk about that. I think this is the moment where those things are going to come to the fore because you can't do things the way we used to do them and recover from this appropriately. And that's the exciting part for me. It's going to be a challenge, but you go down the list, we're going to need new revenue. We're going to need to make sure we shore up and get kids back to school. And we're going to need to make sure we deploy the vaccine appropriately. Thank God, though, we'll have a partner in the Biden-Harris administration to hopefully help us do that. And hopefully a Senate that'll work with us, but we'll see.
Yeah, we're about to see on that front. Yeah, I mean, look, it's been a brutal year. And it was always going to be a tough year. But the fact that you had such cascading failures at the federal government level has just made it so much worse than it had to be. But you're right, out of that does come opportunities for people, for leaders who are willing to seize on that and make the changes that are needed. Guys, thanks so much for this discussion. We're going to be right back with Team Rising right after this.